Well, tonight we are very pleased and honored to have a very special guest with us as our speaker. We first learned about Kiran a couple of years ago from a wonderful article in the Rotarian magazine, and from the fact that the last time we traveled in his part of the world in East Tennessee, we actually visited the place that he is the president. Kiran Singh Sirah is the president of the International Storytelling Center at the ISC in Jonesboro, Tennessee, which is way up in the tip of Eastern Tennessee, almost in North Carolina. And the reason I know that is that's where my dad grew up. And so Kiran lives in Johnson City, Tennessee, and I've still got relatives that live there. So he's promised me a cold one on his front porch when we go back to visit family someday. But the ISC is an educational and cultural institution dedicated to enriching the lives of people around the world through storytelling. ISC organizes the world's premier storytelling event, which is the National Storytelling Festival, which happens in the fall of the year. And it supports applied storytelling initiatives across a wide variety of industries. Prior to his appointment at the ISC, Kiran developed a number of award-winning peace-building programs in cultural centers across the UK. And you will notice that he has a little bit of an accent, but it's not from East Tennessee. As an artist, folklorist, teacher, and advocate for social justice, he uses the power of human creativity to establish dialogue. He's an advisory member to UNESCO and a Rotary Peace Fellow. He's developed educational programs and publications, articles, talks, and conference papers on interdisciplinary approaches to relationship building in communities around the globe. In 2017, Kiran was awarded the Champion of Peace recognition at the Rotary International ceremony at the United Nations Peace Week in Geneva, Switzerland. Now get this, he shows up in a Sikh tartan and his greeting is Namaste, y'all. I knew you'd like that, Lee Vera Nelson, because namaste is something you always use. What a way to show cross-cultural understanding. This was given to him in recognition of his work to advance the art of storytelling within the arenas of global development and peace building. Kiran firmly believes storytelling not only has the power to enrich lives, but also holds the key to building a better world. Please, District 5440, give a warm welcome to Kiran Singh Sirah from the Rotary Club of Johnson City Morning in East Tennessee.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Chris, District Governor Chris. Thank you so much for that wonderful welcome. And yes, absolutely, there's a cold one waiting for you when you come to town. I also want to thank Caroline as well, and thank you both for your patience over this past year and a bit that we've been in communications. I wish I could be with you in person, but this is good to be with you in Zoom. Greetings, Rotarians. As District Governor Chris mentioned, I do have a bit of an accent, and as you can tell, it's from North Carolina. No kidding. It's not from North Carolina, but I want to wish you a buenos dias, or a buenas tardes, or buenas noches. Or as I like to say, and as Chris mentioned, living in the American South, namaste, y'all. Now, I want to actually begin by asking you all to close your eyes. I want you to picture your childhood home. What image pops into your head first? Perhaps it's a memory so thick and vivid that you remember every detail of it, every image, every smell. Perhaps as clearly as if it happened yesterday. You can open your eyes. For me, it was my mother's voice. To me, my mother was a divine feminine goddess, a lion, confident and strong. So I'm about 10 years old and I'm getting ready to go to school. And I hear my mum lean out the front door of our concrete house in South England and call out in her loud, proud voice, "Tea's ready, boys." I come downstairs to find 10 burly men in our kitchen, sipping on good English tea in my mother's best cups and digging into a beautiful array of British biscuits. These were the neighborhood dustbin men or garbage men. And there were so many of them that they spilled out into the garden. Their trucks were parked 4 deep out onto our cul-de-sac street off Chaffinch Road. And they're laughing with my mother, telling stories, connecting. I'm guessing that as they collected rubbish in our neighborhood, this was their favorite stop, morning tea time at the Sirah household. Now, why is this memory so fixed into my mind? Partially because it's such an unforgettable image, but also because it happens so often. In the Sikh tradition, which emphasizes serving others, we consider sitting down to share a meal with someone one of the highest forms of prayer. To my mum, it was an expression of who she was. But mostly it sticks with me because of what it taught me. What my mother was showing by inviting the dustbin men into our home and sharing a meal on our best plates and cups was that she valued and respected their dignity. From a tiny kitchen in a concrete housing estate on a dead-end street in a small town in South England, she was doing her part to build a fairer world, to help dismantle historical inequality. She was taking aim at the oppressive systems and cultural violence towards communities that have often been marginalized for thousands of years, all by serving tea to a bunch of strangers, telling stories, and providing a safe space for them to tell theirs. Now, I invite you to close your eyes again. I want you to imagine that you're checking your phone right now and find out that the leader of your country has decreed that you have 3 months to leave. And if you don't, you will be killed. He doesn't care where you go, just not here. And the place that you end up, it'll be a different season. You'll probably look very different from the people currently living there. And you may not be welcomed. You're thinking about, what do I take? Where do I start? You may be wearing various possessions right now. You're thinking, oh, my photo album or my mother's ring, of course. The chipped coffee cup that my grandfather drank out of every day, my laptop, perhaps. Perhaps you're thinking about all the little things that you love that you will have to say goodbye to because you can't load them onto your arms or onto your back. You can open your eyes. Now, that was a dilemma that my parents faced in the summer of 1972. They were living in Uganda. That was their home. And the country's dictator, Idi Amin, declared that all Asian Ugandans would be forced out or executed in 3 months. 50,000 people. Some fled to Kenya, others to Canada or India. But my parents, Sikhs of Indian heritage, went to the United Kingdom. And what little they lugged with them was stolen by robbers en route to the airport. And when they arrived in a small English town called Eastbourne, it was in the middle of the British winter. They didn't even have the right clothes on them. It was also in the midst of a terrible anti-immigrant wave in England. A lot of people hated them on sight. Now, that home that I described to you, that little English cul-de-sac where my mother welcomed strangers for tea, that was where my parents ended up. Now, just consider for a moment how much you carry into your head. The human brain consists of about 100 billion neurons, and each neuron forms about 1,000 connections to other neurons. They keep combining so that each neuron helps move multiple memories at a time, which exponentially increases the brain's memory storage capacity to something like 1 million gigabytes. And according to Paul Reber, a professor at psychology of Northwestern University, if your brain worked like a DVR, it would have enough bandwidth to hold 3 million hours of TV shows. That's like 300 years of TV on Netflix. Now look around the Zoom. Everyone around you has stories, memories, millions of moments from their lives that make up who they are, what they believe, where they've been, and where they want to go. It's not just the anecdotes like, oh yeah, one time when I was 11, the funniest thing happened. It's the lore that gets passed down from parents and grandparents, the idiosyncrasies, the histories, the recipes, the music. It's your DNA. These are the gifts that you will pass on to those that come after you. It's what binds you to the past. A story has the potential to hold time and to stop it too. And if we're willing to listen, it's what binds us to each other. My storyteller friend from Alabama, Miss Dolores Hydock, would call the act of telling people your stories greasing the pan. Now, it's an important ritual, something I've learned here living in the US South, an important ritual to get to know someone before going too deep. You grease the pan. When I asked my father years later, what was it like to be expelled from his home at gunpoint and stuffed through a border into a country in the midst of an anti-immigrant backlash fomented by its government and forced onto the streets by skinhead thugs wearing green bomber jackets, DM boots, and white laces. And he said something I didn't expect. I expected something about the terror that he and my mother felt, the challenges, the uncertainty of it all. And his response, no, son, it was fun. Me and your mum were young. We were 21. We had nothing to lose. And we were doing it all together as one family. We made friends. Those were the good days. Now, granted, my dad is a glass half full kind of guy. Yeah, Idi Amin, he wasn't that bad. But the point is, my parents didn't need material things to connect with new people or have new experiences, or to remember the old ones. They had everything they needed in each other, in their own heads, and in their openness to new experiences. It probably comes as no surprise that my parents stood out in their new home. My dad showed me our town's newspaper that he saved, one of the first new possessions from 1972. And the front page headline of a local Eastbourne Herald read, Eastbourne receives Ugandan refugees. And there was my father with a bright red turban and a colorful African shirt. And my mother wore an even brighter red sari. My dad loves to tell a story about a kid who saw them and yelled, look, Mum, aliens. And he didn't mean immigrants. He actually meant aliens from outer space. My dad loved that. And he still tells that story. But most people in town were good to my family. And their story became my story. I grew up in Eastbourne. It was right on the coast. As the crow flies, it's 50 miles south of London. You could actually see France on a clear day. And I spent a lot of time on the beach. I'd hang out with friends under the pier, go for walks around the rocky pools, and eat fish and chips with pickled eggs covered in malt vinegar and salt wrapped in paper. The fat, soggy chips kept your lap warm. And anything left over, I'd throw to the seagulls. I remember walking down the street near my house one day and throwing a stone at a wasp nest and getting stung on my big toe. In a lot of ways, I was a typical kid. But I was also the first person with dark skin to be born in my town. We were brown in a white community, and that wasn't always easy. I have 26 stitches on my face. I've been beaten up so many times I've lost count. A neo-Nazi knocked me from my BMX bike when I was just 5 years old. And I've had my head stomped on and woke up in hospital on various occasions. The racism was always there, and I was always on guard. For me, there was a wasp nest on every other corner, but I just accepted it as a fact of life. What was harder for me to deal with was feeling like an outsider in my own country. When I was called a smelly immigrant or a Paki, these derogatory words, I felt like a visitor, not a native. When somebody would shout out, go back to where you come from, and I thought, where is that? I was born in England. I knew of no other place. I hated that feeling of always being the one and only person that stood out. I had to either figure out a way to answer back, ignore it, shrug it off, or find a way to maneuver through these conversations. We'll get back to that. But first, go back to where you come from. I want to focus on those words for just a moment. When I was 6, I visited India for the first time. It was an incredible experience. I remember the sights and sounds of organized chaos, a cacophony of beeps and horns and Vespa scooters and Royal Enfield bullet motorcycles. I remember the shops and the rickshaws, the markets, the street foods and carts and wheels, and the thin, crispy puree with chickpeas, potatoes, various chutneys and hot sauces and pani juice made from tamarind that would explode in your mouth. The chai stand on every corner serving hot milky tea. I remember every detail. Once the hottest tea had been poured from the ladle by the chaiwala into tall glasses, everyone, men in suits, children in school uniforms, teenagers in matching college attire, and women in salwar kameez, they all drank the same way, holding the glass with a thumb and little finger. My mother took me to one of our original villages in the lush green fields of Punjab in northern India. There were no rules and no curfew. What seemed like the whole village would hang out in one house with multiple activities going on. Some sat on the cushions on the floor and watched a 6-hour Bollywood movie. The kids played up on the veranda. Older women would lead in folk songs and stories while keeping the beat from the dolki drum, or someone else tapped on the body of the drum with a metal spoon. It was more like just about being there and sharing space than watching a movie. And while we were there in India, my mother took me to one of the most famous langars in the world, the Golden Temple. Sikh temples are built around the langar, which is basically a community kitchen that offers free meals to anyone and to all visitors, no exceptions. The Golden Temple is like the world's largest soup kitchen, serving handmade vegetarian meals to around 50,000 people a day. We sat on the floor with everyone, rich, poor, men, women, straight people, trans people, all religions and colors and abilities, serving one another, serving a meal as equals. I never forgot that, especially in India, where the caste system sees entire swaths of people as untouchables, not even worthy to eat food with. Eating at the Golden Temple didn't just feel good, it was a political act that broke down the caste system one meal at a time. And back in England, my mother turned our home into a mini langar. One time when she was called for jury service, I came home from school to find the whole jury team hanging out in our living room drinking tea. She embodied the Sikh philosophy of Nirbhau Nirvair, which translates into no fear, no hate. Another time she made me clean the hundreds of pairs of shoes that congregants had left outside a Sikh temple in London. A lesson of teaching me to never be ashamed, to do the work of service to others. What my parents did in Eastbourne and the way that people responded became a blueprint for my life. They brought their culture and their stories with them proudly, despite their differences. They kept an open heart and an open door to their neighbors. Even when that kindness was not always returned, they talked and they listened, they communicated, they tried to understand. Where are you from? A fairly simple question, right? People ask it all the time. And for most of you, for most of us, when someone asks you, where are you from? You have an answer. But we're all from more than the town that we grew up in. Where did I come from? England, yes, but also the villages of Punjab, the boats in Mumbai upon which my grandfathers left India in the 1940s, bound for East Africa. I come from the railroads they built across the deserts from the coastal city of Mombasa, Kenya, to Jinja, a small town and the source of the River Nile in Uganda. I come from the well that my grandfather dug with his own hands, so thirsty workers who passed by his house could drink fresh, clean water in the scorching sun. I come from the hut where my mother went to school in Tororo, a tiny rural town on the border between Uganda and Kenya. I come from the urban, compact neighborhood in Kampala, where my father grew up with 4 of his siblings. I come from the plane that transported them from the turmoil of East Africa to a different brand of turmoil in the United Kingdom. I come from all these places, some of which I've seen with my own eyes, and others of which I've imagined 1,000 times while hearing the stories that my family passed down through the years. And they're all part of my story. It's the idea that home is more than about a physical place. It's in the imagination. It moves beyond borders. But the most creative place for making home will always come from the heart. Every one of you, in the Zoom, in the room, we're all in the process of creating our own narratives. Our stories are not static. What have you learned from your family stories? How are they changing you? And how are your stories affecting those that will come after you? For me, I listened to the stories of my family and friends, and I knew that there was a bigger world out there beyond my hometown. And I wanted to see it and experience it and grow from it. I've called England home, but also Scotland and Northern Ireland and North Carolina, and now the hills of East Tennessee. I almost always stand out. Usually I arrive with little in way of possessions, but generally I leave with riches of stories and experiences and friends, and a greater sense of assurance and belief in myself. Trains, planes, buses, my Subaru Forester. These places of transition have become places of home for me. That sense of movement feels comfortable to me, and I find myself connected to others who have found themselves on the move. Go back to where you come from. Sure, then bring it back to your new surroundings proudly. Discrimination against people is wrong. I believe we're all in agreement with that. But discriminating between people, and that is looking at how we're all different and belong to unique stories, is crucial. It's the best way to develop a world based on mutual respect and discourse. In Sikhism, my religion, there's a philosophy, sort of like a call for duty, that you should go out into the world and adopt 5 different religions or 5 different ways of life that aren't your own. Fully immerse yourself in those traditions and those communities. Learn the language, the poetry. And when you're done with the 5th, your journey is complete. You feel connected to others with different beliefs. You now understand what it means to be a Sikh and part of a larger world. In essence, you arrive home. Your lot in life is to learn. Now, that's the same spirit that what I try to teach now as the president of the International Storytelling Center, which, as Chris mentioned, is a non-profit arts organization based in Jonesboro, Tennessee, our state's oldest town. So if there's anything you remember, or one thing that you remember from today, let it be this: listening leads to understanding, understanding leads to connection, and connection leads to peace. Storytelling, regardless of the form it takes, helps fill in the completeness of who we were and what we can be. And it not only enriches lives, it can help us change the world. This nation is in the midst of an identity crisis. The painful legacies of our past, the Civil War, slavery, Jim Crow, it's always been there beneath the surface. It may feel like it's bubbling over at the moment, but how do you see this particular moment in history? Is it horrifying, sad, dangerous in its uncertainty? And all those things may be true, but I also see it as an opportunity. Some of the greatest moments in human history come from a collapse or an upheaval, which often sprouts movements that advance far beyond what we previously knew. A couple of years ago, I listened to a talk given by Dr. Bernice King, daughter of the great civil rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King, when she visited my town. And she said something that stayed with me. She said something that Black Lives Matter and Donald Trump have in common. Both of them have woken this country up to the great disparities that already exist. And regardless of political beliefs, everyone I've shared that with agrees. When September the 11th happened, I was living in a commune, a hippie commune in Edinburgh, Scotland. There was an attack on a mosque and a synagogue shortly after that in my community, and it woke me up. I finally understood the path that I wanted to take, and I began to understand myself and the outlines of the story that I wanted to see in the world and how I could make it happen. You can't imagine how good that felt. I pulled out the phone book, the yellow pages, and I found every place of worship in Edinburgh. I invited imams and priests and rabbis, everyone, to come together. 6,000 people showed up at that event, which was held at the National Museum of Scotland. Coptic Christians sang songs of resurrection in Arabic. Sikhs wore the Scottish Sikh tartan and performed traditional bhangra with bagpipes. Jewish Scots performed music that combined Scottish Celtic and klezmer traditions. In other words, and their band was called Celtica Schmeltica, by the way. In other words, each group came together in a safe environment with a feeling of unity in the air, a feeling of hope, and they shared their stories with each other. Now, did it end the world's problems? No. But I'm willing to bet that after that day, many of those 6,000 people saw the world differently. And they took that new empathy with them back to their congregations. Yes, we are living in difficult times. The world is divided in so many ways. And the way to bridge that divide, I believe, is by asking questions, by talking, being willing to open yourself up, to make yourself vulnerable, to listen and perhaps listen in new ways. Now, this might seem like an impossible task, but it can also happen on a personal level, one connection at a time. In 2011, I moved to the United States to become a Rotary Peace Fellow at the University of North Carolina. And during my time in Chapel Hill, I spent nearly 2 years listening to people's stories at a homeless shelter. One man carried a love letter to a woman that he had never sent in case he met her again. Another told me that he could only fall asleep in the shelter by visualizing by being somewhere else, like the Swiss Alps or farmlands that he knew from memory. He said, I close my eyes and I try to make it so that it's nice. He said, like a home. I met two young men in a cafe that were living in a shelter. One came from the north and the other from the south. And they told me that they were both rejected by their families and met sleeping under a bridge one day. And since then, they found each other and fell in love. Their home existed in their relationship to one another. They were now on that journey together. But none of my interactions stuck with me more so than Johnny's. Johnny was an elderly man. He was white. He had a weathered face and a scraggly goatee and a deep voice. I was very used to having surface conversations with most people in Chapel Hill outside that shelter, but my conversation with Johnny went deep, fast. We talked about personal circumstances and struggles, the world around us. I loved our talks. They were honest cultural exchanges. But I could tell he was kind of holding back. He always seemed to be reaching to find the right words that could describe life as a shelter resident. We began meeting regularly, sitting outside the shelter and smoking cigarettes and chatting. And one day I invited Johnny to lunch. I asked him what he considered home, and his answer surprised me. He began talking about how he had once been a professional baker and about all the food that he had cooked for his friends and family that he once had, once upon a time, and how he used to get up really early every morning about 4 a.m. and manage 32 ovens at the same time so he could produce thousands of Southern biscuits in a single morning while usually listening and jamming to Eric Clapton. As he told his stories about cookies and cobblers and how he turned Oreo pies into an art form, Johnny's speech became more natural, even exuberant. Baking was something that he felt proud of, and he talked about it with authority. It was almost poetic. We kept meeting and having conversations, and at one point he told me that I was his only friend. Another day he said, until I get out of this shelter, I will not be comfortable, not until I can get to a place and start drawing money. To Johnny, home was not a physical place. It was a feeling of comfort he could revisit in his imagination. Where it existed on the map was not important, but I learned that his happiest memories were actually up in the Black Mountains of Northwest North Carolina. I was really good up there, he said. To him, a sense of home meant much more than having a place to sleep and to eat. It meant a sense of becoming established, feeling grounded, feeling valued, belonging. On Thanksgiving Day in 2012, I went to find Johnny at the shelter. I wanted to share a Thanksgiving meal with him, but he was gone. I found out that he had left the shelter, and I was told he'd moved back to the Black Mountains. Did our conversations lead to his move? I like to think so. Maybe talking about it enabled him to transition from shelter life sooner rather than later, back to a place of comfort. I miss him, but I can only hope that he's found a new sense of home. Now, what lesson can we draw from this story? Dozens, really, but we'll start with this. Everyone is a storyteller. Not many people were bothering to listen to Johnny anymore, but once he began talking about the thing that he loved, he transformed into a great storyteller. His stories were a way for him to make sense of his personal challenges and battle back against the stigma of homelessness. He just needed somebody's ear. Storytelling leads to understanding. Just by being there as he opened up, I understood who Johnny was in a way that his circumstances at the time couldn't possibly convey. And he opened my eyes, offering a new, unique way to think about the notions of home, displacement, diversity. Because many of us are in our own states of homelessness, and that includes every one of us in this room or Zoom. We are constantly searching for recognition, for a sense of community, for belonging. We all desire to be loved and a chance to love. In other words, we are in search of a sense of home. Johnny taught me to understand the world in a new, more expanded way. That listening leads to understanding. Understanding leads to connection, and connection leads to peace. Imagine if the world were filled with more interactions like these. Now, this might sound daunting, but you don't need to spend months building connections. You start with one person, one conversation. Everyone is a storyteller, every one of you. We just need the will and the forum. My dad would always say, "Oh, I don't have anything to say. I'm not a storyteller." But give him some whiskey and some masala chicken, and suddenly he's Mark Twain. And once you understand that your own story matters, it's not a large leap to understand that other people's matters too. I live in America and I do my job because I believe this country has the potential to be one of the greatest peace players in the world. I have also been an outsider, an immigrant to 5 countries, and I've learned over the years to use that status as a strength. As a son of refugees and as a minority who has experienced marginalization, I can use my old experiences as the target of racial hatred and help others to break through the silence and other barriers. And that's really our mission at the International Storytelling Center. We're rooted in a small Appalachian town in the US South 49 years ago. We've helped to professionalize storytelling and establish strategic partnerships with the US State Department, the White House, the Smithsonian Institution, the United Nations, everywhere from Silicon Valley to the Pentagon to Her Majesty the Queen of America, Miss Dolly Parton, helping to tell the hero's journey of coming back home. But at its roots, storytelling is a folk art. It belongs to the people. Every one of us and everyone we serve, those you know personally and those that you don't. So it's important for us to bring storytelling to people as a tool, not just as an evening's entertainment. We're not just talking about people sitting on porches and swings and spinning yarns over lemonade, but that is part of it too. Storytelling has to evolve. We work to develop festivals and community events and podcasts and even video games, downloadable toolkits for educators, anything that will reach people where they are and get them thinking beyond what they're told through a soundbite on the news. Sometimes we help rural hospitals and farm spaces, shops and family laundrettes become cultural hubs by transforming these places into storytelling spaces. Not everyone's going to come to an art center, so it's important for us to go to them. When I took my job at the ISC, one of my first tasks was to go out and meet potential donors. That's what you do when you run a nonprofit. And here I was, the new guy in town, East Tennessee. Here I am, a brown European liberal in a predominantly white conservative region. And I thought to myself, how is this going to work? One of the first people I got to meet was a Mr. Scott Nicewanger. Scott is a self-made man and a highly influential philanthropist in our region. When we met, the first thing he did was ask me for my story. So I told him about my upbringing, my parents fleeing Uganda, a lot of what I told you. And he smiled. He told me that not many people knew this, but during that time, he was a cargo plane pilot and he delivered food and goods to the refugees fleeing the borders into Kenya. I was stunned. It's not often I get to meet someone that already knew my story and was already part of it. I got to shake the hand of the man that helped my people thousands of miles away before I was even born. We were already connected and would never have known that if it wasn't for the chance to meet and to connect. Sometimes the listening leads to moments like these, moments that will occur years from now. And you never know, our stories can affect the world in years to come, even generations to come. Our paths cross over in so many unexpected ways. And if we foster a listening culture, which is essentially what storytelling is about, who knows how connected we might be. But you don't need to be an outsider or part of the ISC, the International Storytelling Center, to change the world. We can do it by listening. When marginalized people suffer, we hear their stories and record the tragedy and the healing. So that record will be there in 10 years down the line to remind us of a place and time that we don't want to go back to. Nothing is gained by pretending that these histories that are not necessarily rosy or wonderful, never happened. We have to remember that we go to Holocaust museums to understand our mistakes of the past and learn for ourselves. We are curious beings after all, and we have a desire to discover the truth for ourselves. A story told by the person is inherently good because it holds truth, as long as it holds truth for the teller, and our role is to listen. In Appalachia, where I live, no one has asked people for their stories. When someone asks, "What does the Confederate flag mean to you?" everyone tenses. Any individual who dares to answer the question is opening him or herself up to attack. But as a symbol, the flag obviously holds different meanings to different people. We are in positions of power, every one of us. And as leaders, we must be willing to create safe spaces for people to speak. I believe it's our civic duty. This may mean listening to stories that make us feel defensive, even angry. How far are we willing to go to listen? If we really believe in healthy discourse and dialogue, we've got to be willing to face the discomfort. We cannot be afraid. Remember that little cul-de-sac that I described to you at the beginning of this talk? But I want to end with a house on another little street in another small town. It's not the south of England, but rather in the mountains of East Tennessee. It's my street in Johnson City. I have conservatives living on one side and liberals on the other. In the middle is a modest house owned by a brown-skinned, beatboxing, English-born Sikh of British, Asian, Indian, and African descent who periodically wears a kilt and plays the didgeridoo on his porch. I may as well be an alien. But we eat together, we drink together, we celebrate birthdays together, and even when we disagree, we listen to each other. I try to make my house a lot like the one that my mother made in England. In 2016, just before a Black Lives Matter rally here, I hosted a dinner in my home. 5 people attended, 2 activists organizing the rally, and the town's white Republican mayor, an African-American clergyman, and me. I cooked all day, and when they arrived, I said, "Before we talk politics, we're going to break bread." As a Sikh, we don't actually break bread. We sit on the floor and eat roti with our hands, but here we are in East Tennessee, so I say we break bread. The 5 of us ate spicy curry together, and I watched the barriers melt away. And when it came time to talk, everyone shared their stories and listened with an open heart. We came to an understanding about what we could do together. The mayor, although in disagreement, still ended up attending the rally himself. Listening leads to understanding. Understanding leads to connection, and connections lead to peace. Yes, 2021 is complicated, but if it seems like we're getting further away from understanding those that are different from us, it's because perhaps we're not trying hard enough. If it isn't coming from our elected leaders, the ones that we put into office, then we need to and should lead ourselves. And we can all do that. We can go deeper than the superficial stories that we're offered on TV and or online and talk to one another, to individuals about their lived experiences. We can find the spaces and cafes and porches and local events for people to tell and listen to stories inclusively. Just as there's no one story that makes up this nation, there's no one story that makes up the places we live and work and call home. And in order for this work, we've got to understand that thinking for ourselves as artists and see the artistry that exists in all of us. You're an artist, you're a storyteller. Your story is your own to tell, and it's different from anyone else's on this earth. Tell it, embrace the creative process. Be willing to open yourself up and make yourself vulnerable. Be honest, and let's find ways to listen to those stories that can build empathy and understanding. America is made up of millions and millions of stories. Heartbreaking, hilarious, poignant, complicated, infuriating, fascinating narratives that go far beyond a 140 character tweet. And these are the kinds of stories that can only come from personal contact. And all we've got to do is listen to them. So one question I want to leave with you, and I hope that you'll think about more and ask others, and that is, what's your story? Namaste. Thank you all for listening.
Kiran, thank you. Thank you so much. I knew that having you come to visit us in District 5440 was going to be worth the wait, but what a fabulous presentation. I think we have some time for some questions.
Yeah, totally.
Assistant Governor Phil Murphy, who is a storyteller himself, has a question. How do we set the stage for people to feel safe to tell their stories?
Great question. And I think it's a difficult one depending on who we are, where we are in that community. And I always like to think, well, how can we replicate the front porch that I have a front porch, I live in the South, it's a traditional home. How do we find those front porches in the community? Now it could be a church, could be a mosque, could be a synagogue. If you are in a position of power, I would say, is there a way that when I worked in a museum, it wasn't about bringing people to the museum first. I had to go to the places of worship. in the community? Where do we find the safe spaces? And it's very important. Best storytelling comes when people feel safe. We have to have trust that leads to vulnerability, leads to authenticity, leads to connection. And those places that take time, that's the idea of the ritual of greasing the pan. We've got to start in a place before going to. So it's an idea, not just a physical place, about creating those relationships. And I think, there are places like cafes and porches. If we run events or festivals like a strawberry festival, let's create a storytelling space in that space. Just people to come and share stories. We do a thing in Jonesboro where we make little pop-ups. They're only about 1 feet off the ground. And we just put them on the street. And without even any curation, families will come together. A little child would stand up on it and tell a story to their great-grandparent. And then the great-grandparent will stand on it and tell a story to their child. Intergenerational experiences. And you don't even have to curate it. You just have to create the pop-up. And I think there's lots of opportunities like that in, obviously, Rotary is a perfect example for an opportunity to share stories. Paul Harris was mentioned earlier, and I can guarantee that when he sat around the table in Evanston, Illinois, they didn't talk in facts. They shared stories about where they came from, who they want to be, etc. It was a storytelling, and Rotary itself is that space. But those that maybe not be in Rotary, we think about those barriers to feeling included. So I think it's about thinking about the workspaces, the staff rooms, and maybe going out into even rural spaces or areas where might feel the other person might feel more comfortable if you feel helping them to feel safer. That when you go to them, then you're obviously showing that you respect them, particularly if you're in a position of power. I'm open to any other questions that you might have.
Kiran, I have a question. This is Krishna from Fort Collins, Colorado.
Hello, Krishna.
And, as you mentioned, when we...
Well, Krishna, you silent yourself there. You just put you muted yourself. You unmute.
Thanks for the chance. When we...
I was asking from Fort Collins how to put yourself in a congenial space where people from different points of view can come together and find out that they have more in common than more differences. Could you please comment?
Okay. Oh, sorry. Let me just. Oh, Krishna's. Okay. Let me just read that. There's always things that. So it depends on how one might do that. Okay. Let me give an example. In 2016, Senator Corker, Bob Corker, he's a Republican senator, and he was also the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and his team reached out to us, and we had a connection, we had a friendship, and I got invited by a group of Quakers in DC to see if I could somehow bring Senator Corker to support a piece of legislation. So somehow, I don't know how it happened, but I ended up at the Senate in Washington, D.C., facilitating a conversation with Democrats, Republicans, Quakers, Hindus, and Christians around a table. But I didn't ask them, what's your Republican story or what's your Democrat story? I said, tell me about the moment that made you think differently about the world and made you want to be a peace builder and what brought you to this table. I asked people to go deeper into their passions, their heart, that goes beyond the labels of politics or religion. And immediately what we end up doing was talk about our experiences, life, our parents. I talked about when I saw, after 9/11, I realized my world mattered. And that was a really big, important thing. And I think essentially what we're doing now is we're creating a map of the imagination. Now imagine your stories not as linear, but as a tapestry, right? It's a really good way to think about storytelling is not linear, not one, it's a tapestry. And you're weaving your tapestry of stories with others. Every time we share a story with another, we create these kind of shared maps. When I talk to you about my religion, my beliefs, etc., but when I talk to you about loss or love, a desire of belonging, you can relate to that. If I say about my grandmother, you picture your grandmother. And what we're doing, we're creating a shared tapestry. And that is the space where we can build what I believe is like we create this connection of understanding, because beyond the labels, beyond groups, beyond nationalities, these social constructs, there is a deep internal desire that we want to be loved, we want to feel connected, we experience life, loss, suffering, and pain. And when I can hear the pain and suffering from someone that I perceive as different, then I immediately feel a connection. Pat Speet, Irish storyteller, says the closest distance between two people is a story. And I believe that is with every single person on the planet, regardless of where they come from. So I think it's very important to remember that we are all already connected. And storytelling helps to diffuse that when we get to the heart, what's in our hearts, truly in our hearts.
Kiran, from our district governor-elect Sharice Shield, do you believe that good storytelling is a personal trait that can be learned, or do people just have that innate trait? And how do you get better at telling your story?
I like to think about it this way. I get asked to do a lot of conferences sometimes, not this type of conference, but like on Monday, I did a training conference for a group of executives in Europe, and they wanted that. And I say, first of all, forget the elevator pitch that went out in the 80s, as far as I'm concerned. What you want to do is imagine it like this. When Michelangelo, the Italian Renaissance artist, painted the 16th chapel, he created a masterpiece, but he didn't learn to paint in a 1-hour workshop on how to paint. The same is with storytelling. You have to think about, do you want to create a masterpiece, or do you just want a quick formula, a quick tweak? And the idea is that it takes practice. Michelangelo was actually not very good at painting. He was challenged to that idea, and he had to learn the skill sets, and he practiced and practiced and practiced and practiced. So I don't necessarily believe that you're born with it. It's something that you harness, you cultivate, it can be your environment. My friend grew up in a traditional African-American church in South Carolina. He's a fantastic storyteller. He doesn't call himself a storyteller, but he is, because he's surrounded by a culture that's so rich in storytelling. But we all are. We're all storytellers. When you talk to there might be your best friend or your children or a particular person, when you share with them, you become the exuberant storyteller because you're passionate about something. Let me tell you about this terrible date I just had. It was horrible. You can tell that story in a very passionate, freeing way because it's with someone that you love. There's trust. So I think it's really about practice. There are people that hone that craft in, and it's helpful if you're thinking about the telling stories, compelling stories. I think the most compelling stories will always come from the heart, and it's the deep dive of finding out if it really rings true for you, and if it makes your heart sing, and it's important to you. That will be felt by others. And if you want to tell it in a compelling way, like on a stage or whatever, then practice that format in that context, but keep practicing. It's like writing or any art form. You have to practice at it. So I don't believe that one is born better than others, although I think people are given social spaces that we may be exposed to more. I was born in, my family many of them were illiterate, but I grew up in a tradition where we had hundreds of people gathered in the house, playing drums and set up all night telling stories. That was very much my family. But yeah, keep practicing. If you want thinking about stories for social movements, then that's a different sort of a different story. You might want to think about that's the next stage. That's the deeper stage about how do you stories for social movements. But one thing I want to add, people ask me, how do we tell Rotary story? And I would say, if there's 1.2 million members of Rotary, then there's 1.2 million stories of Rotary. There's no one story. And that's a really important thing. Your story, your connection to Rotary, its impact on you, on your life, what matters to you is equal to any grand marketing company that wants to try and create a messaging. Your single story is Rotary's story. And by harnessing that and sharing it, you can share that in a compelling way if it's important to you. Do you want to read out I'm not sure where to go with the questions. Oh, somebody wants me to hear play the didgeridoo. Maybe. I'm trying. DG Chris, would you like to read out any questions, or
Yes. Bill Emsley had a question about how you would diffuse conflict in a conversation that may arise when you are having an encounter with someone.
That's really, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on that one. I mean, we all want to be heard. People want to be heard, and sometimes diffusing conflict is by not reacting. It's kind of holding back and just listening, because often people want to be heard. If they're telling you something, it's just because they want to hear it. And I guess it goes back to this idea, whether it's depends on what context and how, but ultimately the idea is that I believe that there's no such thing as a fictive narrative if that story holds truth for the teller. It may be factually something I don't believe in. Like, for example, somebody might be telling me about a creation story, which I don't factually believe in, but if it's part of something that you believe in, important story to your identity, then it holds truth. There's truth in it. It just depends how I'm listening to that truth. I have to listen to it in a new way. If somebody tells me about this flag means this, it's my identity. This Confederate flag is my identity. It's my, well, that's not saying it's not something I want to support, but it's still, there's truth in if it holds truth for you, because it's a meaningful connection that you're holding on to, or you have. And there's something that I might need to, if my intention is to find out more about you, then it's important for me to listen and hear that. Where's the meaning? And I think that's an important part to conflict prevention. How to diffuse tension, I think that's another, we have to move as soon as we can to a safe space. We have to potentially just listen rather than respond, and allow us to kind of like build upon what somebody might have said, and maybe build upon that experience. Finding a way to relate and connect is a really important part to kind of, if you want to have a conversation.
Issue of listening. Could you please share, Kiran, how you would recommend we become better listeners so that we can make those connections? And is being a good listener something that we can teach?
Yes, I believe it, and again, I mean, I think essentially what Miss Catherine Tucker Wyndham, who's deceased now, but she was from Selma, Alabama, and she's considered America's matriarch for storytelling. She was a short white woman from the South, and she always would close our festival. And her mantra was that storytelling teaches us to listen. When you listen, when you're attuned to storytelling, when you hear stories, what the storytelling art form is actually doing is teaching us to listen. It's opening doors in that sense. So I think from that perspective, yes, but I think also, there's the art of listening, I guess, I'm a trained folklorist. Doesn't mean I'm a very good folklorist, but I'm a trained folklorist. And I would suggest that, there are ways that we might, we have to practice that kind of be mindful. Here's another example, maybe from a philosophical way to think about listening. Imagine, a spectrum from listening to telling. And you imagine, where are you on that spectrum in society? Historically, as a man, I've always had the microphone. There are people in my environment that haven't historically. Women haven't had the microphone as much as men. So partly my role is like, in what context can I step back and relinquish power so that other people have that microphone? The context might be very different if we're in a white, Black, Latinx communities, or wherever we might be. How can we also relinquish figuratively the microphone? And maybe my job right now is to listen more than I need to tell. So I think in that context, but I think actual listening, attention, I think the more we engage and listen to stories, that can help us to develop and attune our ears and our mind to that power, to that ability to absorb new ways of thinking. It takes us on journeys.
We have a question from my fellow club member and good friend, Ted Gilliland. He asks, how do you process your emotions about having had your head stomped on and to go on to become a peacemaker?
Oh, it's a good question. That took time. And I would say that it's not something that I've ever really, I think it's still there. I think I do a lot of work with young people that experience trauma, and we work a lot with kids and teenagers. And I was a high school teacher as well. And most of my kids hadn't seen their parents for 2 weeks. So their trauma was different to mine, but I could relate to it. And I always like to think when we work with kids or young teenagers,
no chips in here. Is Minnie inside?
What I'd like to try and do is look at that experience. And when I would say, look at it, and I blamed myself for many, many years until I got to a place where I realized it wasn't my fault, right? And you can look at that and you can imagine like, well, what have I learned from these processes? How can I rewrite my narrative rather than somebody else write that narrative for me? How can I use that experience and embed it into my story and use it for positive action, for positive. So what I try to do now, when I know that I can talk about that experience in a way that allows me now to talk about it and to empower kids or to teach in the classroom, then I'm using something that's negative to me for a positive. And that's given me the opportunity to take this negative and feel that I can do good in the world with it. So for me, that's very important. Yeah, I think there's other components. I think, mindful work. I do a lot of mindful work as well, and I practice meditation. And I think the idea of that, rather than suppressing any sort of traumatic experience or hurt or pain, the more that we can kind of practice the art of seeing it, looking at it, examining it, and then unpacking it, and recognize that it's there and how we can kind of maneuver around it when we need to, or use it for our advantage if we need to. I think that's a really important part. And it's still a process. It's still a process. I went to a therapist some while back, and she said something to me, there's something you've been hiding behind most of your life, and I'll give you a clue what it is. You advocate for it in healing. I'd actually been hiding behind storytelling itself, something I advocate for. And I had to recognize that when am I performing and when am I kind of like really sort of, and I've been doing that from the playground. So one of the techniques I started to do was I close my eyes and I revisit these stories, because that way I'm actually telling that story to myself, no audience, not performing. And that helped me to unpack that work. And knowing that you're doing good in the world or you're connecting, is such an empowering feeling. It makes me feel alive. So taking difficult experiences and helping others is an empowering feeling. It's and it gives you purpose. And when you have purpose, it's to be a peace builder. For me, there's nothing better. I don't want to be rich. I don't want a big car. I want to be able to make a difference in someone's life. That's my value.
I had one question that said, what resources or programs are available through the ISC that can help us to be better listeners or better storytellers?
Yeah, it's great. So the International Storytelling Center has a bunch of free resources. If you go online, every month we have a program called Freedom Stories, which is free. And it really unpacks looking at Black heritage in Appalachia. It brings together storytellers, poets, and scholars. And we have hours and hours for free footage you can view. I also have a toolkit that is free to download, to use in classrooms. You can use it yourself. It's called Telling Stories That Matter. And I particularly recognize Rotary in it because I wrote it while I was a Rotary Peace Fellow. So that way I've made it free so anyone can use it. And it's free to download for anyone. If you want to like look at how to collect stories with your family members, your community members, et cetera, but also how you can harness different ways of telling stories through photography, through poetry, etc. And if you're a teacher or educator, there's a whole bunch of curriculum stuff for free as well, where for ages grade 3 to 8, where young kids can listen to great storytellers, but there's a curriculum guide to how to talk about those stories. And it's really nice to be able to do that if you've got a kid in your life, that you can have conversations, watch that together, and kind of talk about the story and have conversations around it. It's called Story Guides. But of course, Chris will know that we have the National Storytelling Festival, which is going to be in the fall, 11,000 people gathered. And we have some of the great storytellers from across the nation that will be presenting from various different states. And it's a three-day festival. And it's a beautiful time of the year in these mountains in the fall as well. So, and every week we have a different storyteller online. So you can look at our storytelling online program, and you can join workshops. We have workshops that you can do online, and we also have just performances online as well. But when it's ready, we'll be doing that hybrid in person as well, bringing people back into live performance theatre work. And their website is storytellingcenter.net.
In Jonesboro, and it's a beautiful space. Thank you very much. If people look on the web for the International Storytelling Center, they'll be able to find your resources and see what's going on, what's coming up in the fall. And if anybody is thinking about going to East Tennessee to attend this event, the festival, make your reservations for hotels because they fill up for miles around. So it's quite the event in that part of East Tennessee, and it's really wonderful. It's a wonderful thing to be able to see.
There's always
That's going to
Airbnb.
take care of it. Any
Sorry, what was that? Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's a bit fuzzy, but I can hear just about. Can you say that last thing?
Kiran, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Any final words?
Oh, no, but thank you very much. I love the opportunity to come and speak to you today. Thank you for being so attentive to what I had to say and hear me ramble on. And again, thanks to Caroline and Chris for the conversation we've had over this past year and a half. And just thank you so much for everyone for being here and for giving me the opportunity to come and present to you all today. I really appreciated it. I'm going to stick around for a little while as well, if that's okay.
5440. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your stories and your life. It has really enriched us. It's given us a lot to think about. And I suspect you may be hearing from Rotarians in this district again. They may like to have you come and speak with their club. So thank you very much, everyone. Please thank Kiran for being among us tonight.
Thank you very much.